finally, Jack Nicholson. He turned 89 this week. Nicholson, a three-time Oscar winner, doesn't make many public appearances these days.
And man, he might be the best of all time.
Jack Nicholson holds 3 Academy Awards, 12 nominations, and a reputation as the most electrifying screen presence American cinema has ever produced. For 4 straight decades, he dominated every room he entered, every scene he inhabited, and every serious discussion about acting greatness. Then, somewhere around 2010, he simply ceased to exist in public life. There was no farewell film, no retirement announcement, no press conference, no explanation of any kind. For roughly 15 years, the man who terrorized audiences as the Joker, as Jack Torrance, and as Randall McMurphy has remained locked behind the iron gates of his estate on Mulholland Drive, while the rest of the world has been left to wonder why. Then, in February of 2025, he stepped briefly back into the light, and what the world saw in those few moments communicated more than any interview he had ever given. To truly understand the disappearance, you have to go back to the very beginning, because the first and most defining thing about Jack Nicholson's life was a lie. He was born on April 22, 1937, in New York City, though his family was rooted in Neptune, New Jersey. His mother, June Nicholson, was a teenager and unmarried at the time of his birth. The father was a married man. In that era, in a small town, the scandal would have been devastating and irreversible. So June's mother, Ethel May, stepped forward and made a decision that would quietly shape Jack's entire sense of self. She registered herself as the baby's mother. June was reclassified on paper and in daily life as his older sister. The boy grew up completely convinced that his grandmother was his mother and that his biological mother was nothing more than a sibling. Nobody corrected the story, and in 1954, when travel documents were required, Ethel May reinforced the fiction with an official birth certificate. Jack spent his entire childhood inside a fabricated family structure, absorbing silence and displacement without ever having a name for what he was living through. He would not discover the truth until 1974, when he was already 37 years old and a celebrated actor. A researcher working on a Time magazine cover story called him and delivered the news. By then, June had died of cancer in 1963, and Ethel May had passed in 1970. The people who built the lie were gone before the lie was ever spoken aloud. Nicholson responded with an unsettling composure, saying the revelation was dramatic but not traumatizing because his personality was already formed. But the absence of visible damage does not mean no damage was done. He never married. His romantic life remained deliberately fragmented. The boy raised inside a secret became a man who maintained carefully controlled distance from everyone around him, and that instinct for distance would, in the end, define the final chapter of his life. His rise to fame was anything but inevitable. He spent the better part of the 1960s failing in Hollywood with patience and determination that most people in his position would not have sustained. His very first job in the entertainment industry was not acting at all. He worked as an errand boy at the animation studio, responsible for Tom and Jerry, carrying mail and making coffee, while watching real creative work happen around him. When a full-time animation position was offered to him, he turned it down because the salary was lower than what he was already making. The studio closed shortly after, and he drifted toward acting, training under Jeff Corey, a blacklisted actor turned teacher whose central lesson was that genuine emotion cannot be performed from the outside in. It has to be lived. Nicholson absorbed that philosophy and carried it through every role he ever played. Through the mid-1960s, he appeared in roughly 15 films without generating any real recognition. He turned to screenwriting partly out of desperation, partly out of creative restlessness. The role that changed everything came to him by accident. George Hansen in Easy Rider, released in 1969, was handed to him only because the original actor walked off set after a fight with director Dennis Hopper. The film became a cultural landmark, and Nicholson's performance earned him his first Oscar nomination. What followed was one of the most extraordinary runs of quality work any actor has ever assembled. 5 Easy Pieces in 1970, Chinatown in 1974, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, which won him his first Academy Award and swept every major category. The Shining in 1980, Terms of Endearment in 1983, which gave him a second Oscar. Batman in 1989, where his negotiated profit-sharing deal reportedly earned him somewhere between $60 and $90 million. A Few Good Men in 1992. As Good as It Gets in 1997, his third Oscar. By the turn of the millennium, he was not simply a star. He was an institution. And then, with no announcement, the institution began to quietly close its doors. Before the full withdrawal, however, there is a chapter of his personal life that rarely receives the attention it deserves, because it explains more about the disappearance than almost anything, medical or professional, ever could. Jack Nicholson's romantic history was sprawling, passionate, and ultimately exhausting in its consequences. His relationship with Angelica Huston lasted 17 years and stood as one of the most famous partnerships in Hollywood. He ended it in the most brutal way imaginable, telling her over dinner that another woman was pregnant with his child. Huston, who had faced her own painful fertility struggles, understood the news immediately and told him she would not compete. She walked away from 17 years in a single conversation. The other woman, Rebecca Broussard, gave him a daughter named Lorraine in 1990 and a son named Ray in 1992. But that relationship also eventually ended. A subsequent romance with Lara Flynn Boyle in the early 2000s concluded by the time he was in his late 60s, and by his own admission, he was tired. In a 2013 Vanity Fair interview, one of his last extended encounters with the press, he said something that cut through everything else in the piece. He said he was no longer driven to be out in the world. He said the only films worth making anymore were the ones that genuinely moved people. And then he admitted he no longer had the energy to both work and maintain the kind of extravagant personal life he had always lived, noting that during his final films he barely left his hotel room at night. For a man whose off-screen existence had been as mythologized as his performances, those words marked a genuine ending. His final film, How Do You Know?, was released in December 2010. It was a romantic comedy. It lost approximately $70 million at the box office. And without ever saying so publicly, Jack Nicholson never made another film. The gates on Mulholland Drive closed, and the speculation began almost immediately. In 2013, reports circulated that memory loss had made it impossible for him to learn lines. People close to him disputed those claims, insisting he was still reading scripts and considering projects. In 2017, there was a brief and promising attachment to an American remake of the German film Tony Erdmann, but he withdrew and the production fell apart. Director James L. Brooks later mentioned that Nicholson had continued reading scripts throughout, a detail that is quietly haunting because it suggests he never fully abandoned the idea of working. He just never found a reason to actually do it. By 2021 and 2022, accounts described a man who had essentially stopped leaving his property. His world had contracted to the walls of the compound, and his primary companions became his children, particularly Lorraine and Ray. Ray Nicholson, who has developed his own career in film, has spoken about his father with honesty and warmth, noting their generational difference while acknowledging that eating dinner with his father every night during his upbringing was essentially how he learned to understand other human beings. In May of 2025, a source close to Nicholson gave the New York Post what may be the most candid summary anyone connected to him has ever offered publicly. The source said Nicholson simply did not like being seen in public anymore, that he had been spotted recently and appeared a little unsteady on his feet, and that the extravagant lifestyle and volcanic personality that made him a legend had taken their physical toll over time. Then the source added one sentence that explains everything more clearly than any medical report could. They said Jack and the people around him preferred that the world remember him the way he was. That is not a statement about illness or decline. That is a deliberate, conscious decision made by a man who understood better than almost anyone alive how much the image matters. Even a man that committed to privacy could not entirely resist the pull of one significant moment. On February 16, 2025, NBC broadcast the Saturday Night Live 50th anniversary special, filling Studio 8H with the largest gathering of entertainment talent the show had ever assembled. From his seat in the audience, wearing a dark jacket, tinted glasses, and a Yankees beret. 87-year-old Jack Nicholson leaned forward and spoke 5 words into a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Sandler." The room erupted. Sandler, who had starred alongside Nicholson in Anger Management back in 2003, stood up and urged the audience to recognize what they were witnessing, expressing his love openly before picking up a guitar and performing a tribute to the show's history. For Nicholson, who had not been seen in public since attending a Lakers game in May of 2023, the appearance was genuinely shocking to observers. His daughter Lorraine was seated beside him. Photographers caught him the following morning, leaving the Carlisle Hotel in New York, walking with a cane. Responses were divided between those who were moved to see him looking reasonably well for his age, and those who were struck by how visibly the years had accumulated. He was 87, and the distance between the man in the beret and the man who had once chased Shelley Duvall through a snowbound hotel was 45 years wide. But the significance of the moment went beyond the physical. Nicholson had never hosted Saturday Night Live in his entire career, something he had once admitted regretting. He had appeared at the 40th anniversary in 2015, and now here he was for the 50th, seated in the crowd rather than standing on the stage, delivering 5 words and then disappearing again. It was not a comeback. It was a closing statement dressed as a cameo. 5 words, a wave of applause, from a room full of people who understood exactly what they were looking at, and then he went home. The world he had retreated from continued to deliver losses. On October 11, 2025, Diane Keaton passed away at 79 from pneumonia. Keaton had been among Nicholson's closest and most enduring friends, a creative partner who had shared the screen with him in Something's Gotta Give in 2003, and remained part of the small, tight circle that still had real access to the man behind the gates. Those close to Nicholson expressed serious concern about how the loss would land on a man whose world had already shrunk so dramatically. Losing one of the last genuine connections to the life he once led was understood by everyone around him as a profound blow. Earlier that same year, in July, Danny DeVito had offered the most encouraging public update anyone had given in some time, telling People magazine that he had visited Nicholson around his birthday and found him in genuinely good shape. Their friendship, which began in the early 1970s and never required any formal introduction or warming-up period, remains one of the threads still connecting Nicholson to the outside world. There was also, around the same time, a quiet and deeply human gesture that surfaced when the wildfires devastated parts of Los Angeles in January of 2025. Nicholson reportedly offered his Mulholland Drive home to Angelica Houston, who had lost her own house in the fires. The woman whose heart he had broken over dinner decades earlier was welcomed by the same man who had broken it. Neither of them made the gesture public. It simply happened, and then it was over. The real reason Jack Nicholson disappeared is not a single thing. It is the accumulation of many things that arrived gradually and reinforced each other until staying home became easier than existing in the world. His body slowed. His energy for the work diminished. The industry transformed around him into a landscape of franchises and digital spectacle that had little room for the kind of raw, unpredictable, fully inhabited performances he had always delivered. The relationships that had once kept him anchored to public life ended, one after another, until the circle reduced itself to family and a small number of old friends. And underneath all of it was the instinct he had carried since childhood, that controlled distance is safer than full exposure. The man who spent his early life inside a family secret never fully stopped living inside something. He simply chose, at the end, to make the secret his own. His inner circle said it plainly. They wanted the world to remember him as he was. The Joker, McMurphy, Jack Torrance. Not an 88-year-old man being photographed leaving a hotel with a cane. Jack Nicholson did not lose his place in Hollywood. He released it. He stepped away before the world could watch the image erode, and in doing so he accomplished something almost no star of his magnitude has ever managed. He disappeared entirely on his own terms. No farewell, no ceremony, no final bow. Just a gate on a hillside above Los Angeles, and a silence that communicates everything a lifetime of performance ever could.